Okay. Well, thanks for tuning in. Really lots going on this week besides transactional stuff. Anybody got a transactional issue they want to bring up before I go off on my tangents? Okay. Well, I was just got off a CAR webinar on the NAR lawsuit that came down. The decision came down this week and awarded $5 billion to the plaintiffs. And we'll hear from June Barlow. She's the NAR attorney, CAR attorney, general counsel, on Monday with the BRM webinar on this issue. So we'll have our own kind of chance to ask her questions. But just to give you a little further background, NAR has to post a bond to appeal the case. And when there's a large sum of money like this, the defendant, if they're found to owe a lot of money, has to post a bond. Well, so NAR is busy running around getting a $1 billion bond from somebody. June talked about a number of grounds for appeal, that evidence from the plaintiffs was allowed in that shouldn't have been, and the plaintiffs claimed they didn't understand, they didn't know that they were paying the buyer's agents fee, and various things that should be brought out on appeal, and obviously they wouldn't appeal it if they didn't expect to succeed. She said that currently NAR says they are not going to have any assessment of membership, and we're all members of NAR, to cover these costs or the bond appeal, but that could change. I don't know. Anyway, that's kind of where she was when I dropped off. They made clear at the beginning of that webinar that the buyer's representation form that the CAR has developed is likely to become more popular. We're likely to be using that more with our buyers, and so everyone's clear on the compensation matters. They did point out that CAR's listing form, the RLA, does contain language that states that the commission is to be shared with the buyer's agent, and states the amount. So as long as we're completing our form properly, we would have protection about the seller saying, well, I didn't know I was paying the buyer's agent's commission. But anyway, regarding the buyer representation form, CAR is offering free anytime training. I guess it's a taped training on the use of that form, which we would endorse checking out. And it's free through the end of 2023. I don't know if they'll charge a fee for it after that. If you registered for that training, it's good for a year. So you might just check that out on the CAR website, buyer representation training, and there may be a code. I think it was free. It was the code to put in to get it free. I didn't make a note precisely of that. And it's interesting, the CAR should not recording this webinar or future ones on the basis that it's attorney-client privilege, and it couldn't be called out as evidence in case of a future lawsuit. So CAR was not recording that, so I can't go back and see what it was. But anyway, we'll figure it out from Shannon and Bill, and make sure you have that information on Monday at the latest. Okay, any questions on that? I'll put in the link one more time for the BRM webinar on Monday. I encourage you all to watch it. They say they're recording it, so we'll see if that is the thing. If June Barlow, the CAR attorney, allows them to record it, I don't know. So it may be we may have to watch it live, may not be repeated. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, another new thing came up this week, which CAR had a webinar on, and that is called the Wildfire Disclosure Report. And CAR has been working with a group that is developed something they call a wildfire disclosure report. And it's quite interesting, and I think it'll be quite useful for us because it's like a 20-page report using different sources to determine the fire condition of a property. And there's all kinds of ratings and things that they use, 3 different kind of risk factors. And I'm going to play a little of that webinar here if I can, just to show you. Did anyone else watch that? No one's saying yes. So I'll see if I can share the link to that in my email when the recording goes out. You may have to log in to, when you hit the link, you may have to log in to your CAR account. But let me see if I can pull up part of that. Okay. You can see that screen? It says you can. So I'll assume you can. If you can't see it, unmute and let me know. But this is, I'm going to play this little part when he's explaining how the report is organized. So I'll go for a couple minutes here.
That's the idea. The intention of the report is to provide the data in the context of wildfire risk, so that, as we said, data-driven decisions can be made by an agent, very much in line with the way that a property owner should be looking at this risk when an insurer asks them, and likewise, an insurer will look at this risk when they're determining whether or not to offer coverage and at what rate. So there are 4 primary cornerstones, pieces of information and understanding that the report focuses on. We start with the property itself, the details of the property. I'm going to walk through each one of these in a bit more detail, and then I'll stop and take some questions before we look at an actual report. But we start at the property, and we organize the property, the data, and the visuals of the property so that we can frame the elements as they pertain to wildfire risk. Then we look at the wildfire hazard. So this is the hazard rating that determines the general wildfire risk of the property in the area that the property is located in. With the hazard and the property details framed, we then look at how to make this property comply. How compliant is it today, and what steps might need to be taken to make it aligned with whatever regulatory elements are in place for that home, given where it is. And finally, what steps do we need to take to protect this home? With those 4 elements understood, both visually, graphically, and with data, now you can take some steps to understanding what you might need to do to get this insured and or make an offer and or move through the process of a real estate transaction. So we start with the property. The report, and this report is about a 20-page report that focuses solely on wildfire. But we start with the property up front, and we provide 2 separate views. One is the satellite image, and this is really helpful to help align the data in the report with someone who might be on site, when you go on site to look at the property. What we do here is we provide the defensible space zones. Defensible space is something that we talk about all the time. It's in the regulatory requirements. But here we are putting the specific characteristics of the property, the fuels and the distance right here where you can see it. And in the satellite image on the left, you can see that we identify the zone 0 to 5 feet, zone 1, the 5 to 30 foot area, and then zone 2, 30 to 100 feet. Comes out to here. We actually, with our ignition model, we look at zone 3, which is 100 to 300 feet as well. And what we are doing is we are cataloging all of the fuel sources in those zones. Now, this is a satellite image, and we are dealing with that level of data, so we can't see everything. We can't see everything in the home ignition zone. We can see the heavy fuels, the trees and the structures that drive the great majority of the risk. And so now we've got them laid out in the defensible space zones. You can see we also provide over here a schematic view. And this drawing-like view helps present a couple of elements a little more clearly. First and foremost, the parcel. So we put the parcel here so that you can see which of the wildfire fuels, trees and structures specifically, are on parcel versus off. And you can see all the green trees that are on parcel, all the trees that are on parcel are marked in green. And then
All right. Going to put that on hold for just a minute. So this looks like it's really useful. It would be useful for a seller to get in advance of putting the property on the market. I think it'd be useful certainly useful for a buyer when they get into escrow to understand the fire risk. We have questions about insurance. This can be used, given to an insurance company to evaluate the insurability of a property. So I think these are going to be very popular. I think they look useful. It provides information we've just been guessing at for the most part in filling out those wildfire forms. It's CAR endorsed. They've been working with this group for over a year to develop this report. And it costs $140, which seems like a reasonable expense for either a seller listing their property to get in advance so they understand the situation, or certainly for a buyer when they get into escrow on a property that has a fire risk. It is designed for single-family homes, so they won't be you won't get these reports on multifamily homes, condos, and that sort of thing. And it has a shelf life of about 3 to 6 months, according to them. So it's designed to be transaction specific. But a seller could get it in advance of listing the property, and it could be good for 3 to 6 months, according to them. Let me put it back on for just a minute. There's a part of it that actually shows the report, which I think is helpful.
are marked in a dotted yellow line. This is important because from a regulatory client's perspective, property owner is responsible only for fuels that are on parcel. This is one of the.
Sorry, I'm trying to get this up to be a full screen and get to the part I wanted to see. Oh, why this got small on me all of a sudden.
All right, good morning, CAR members. Thank you all so much for being here. We are beyond excited. I know if you join my.
Again, we've inventoried.
All right.
As presented, if we wouldn't recommend
Out here,
requirements
they
in
look
the
at,
ABA. Todd, we are.
they start looking at a report.
All right. So this is the report. I think it is important for folks to see the report in its full form. The cover page shows the image, a bunch of disclosures.
You can see it's called a wildfire disclosure report
Go into the
for
report.
wildfire risk remediations and insurability assessment.
You doing okay on time?
That's pretty good.
So this is
report,
the report.
I think.
I think it is important for folks to see the report in its full form. The cover page shows the image, a bunch of disclosures, a table of contents. So you can see it's a 21-page report here, going through a bunch of different pages. We do provide a summary. As agents and property owners get comfortable with this data, we wanted to be able to provide a top-level view where you could get just a quick, what is the status? So we provide an overview, CAL FIRE hazard rating, which you get from the NHD report. We just call it out and show it here. So you are subject to AB 38. We give a quick view. This property is non-compliant. We can tell that you've got some roof intersection here with trees. We can see that here. It is deterministic here that you're going to need to get on site and look at this roof line and these trees. We delineate the number of trees by zone here so you can get a quick understanding, and we show the cost indications. Same thing, we show you the top line of the vulnerability. So in one quick view, you can get a sense of where you stand: costs, vulnerability, compliance, hazard rating. This was one of the things that came back. That was the direct result of all of the soft launch work that we did. Then we go through and we provide a pretty thorough explanation of all of the stuff that I just highlighted in the.
Okay. So any feedback on that report? What do you think? Anybody? You got to unmute yourself.
Who generates the report?
It's the company's called Fortress something. It's now a drop down. They added it as a drop down selection in the RPA. So I will show you that in just a moment under additional reports. So their company is right there.
And you can, it will pick up, you can designate a specific address.
Specific address, single family home.
Is there additional cost for it?
Well, it costs $140.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, how much? $140. And the NHD is separate. It's in addition to the NHD. But gives you a lot of more information than the NHD does about all this wildfire stuff that we've been trying to figure out. Any other comments on it? No, they don't write insurance, Curtis. The question was if they write insurance themselves. No, they aren't an insurance company. I believe it's a consulting firm of some sort. But I watched the entire presentation and their attention to detail and their data. It looks really good. Oh, do they insure their reports? That's a good question. I don't recall them saying that, like the NHD provide those $1 million policies if they report something wrong, but I don't know. I've never heard anyone make a claim against the NHD for the, so I think it's a pretty superfluous insurance, offer, because I don't think you're ever going to use it. Steve asked, does the 140 feet cover any amount of acres? Yeah, the size of the parcel doesn't matter. They don't do raw land, as far as I understand. But no, they didn't. They said one fee applies to all properties, regardless of their size and the extent of the improvements. Because what they're looking at is fire risk, which is a quantifiable thing. Let me pull up the RPA and close that. And okay. Go to share here. And so the RPA, they just added this, I think, yesterday, down under Q2 here. And if you click on Q2, you see Fortress Wildlife Disclosure. So that's the report. And you could put it in your RPA. If the seller hasn't gotten one, hasn't provided one, and you're writing an RPA for a buyer, and you can ask the seller to provide it, and you can check who's going to pay for it. I don't know if there's other providers. I think you can order it through your NHD company. So if you're ordering an NHD on your listing in advance, you can order it as part of your NHD orders. These companies, NHD companies, will also contain an order for the Fortress wildfire disclosure. So that's interesting that they've added it right there in other reports. Okay. Well, any questions on that? I'm going to, if not, I'll move on to a couple other forms that came up this week. Okay. We'll hear more about that. And I'm sure broker risk management will have a weekly practice tip on that very shortly.
Gary,
Yeah.
I had a question. Do you think that at some point this kind of thing might happen for flood as well, just because we're getting more flood in certain areas too, as the climate keeps getting worse?
That's possible. I really hadn't thought about it.
Okay.
I hadn't thought about this report either, but someone is.
Yeah.
They say they worked for 3 years to develop the
Wow.
technology to pull these reports together, because they're dependent upon other third party, just like the NHD reports do. They go out to third party databases and pull in the information. So these guys, they had to develop a whole database so
Yeah.
they can make these reports.
Okay.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so a claim came up this week. Well, it wasn't a claim. It was a situation where our seller got an offer. We're representing the seller, and they wrote a counter offer, and they were waiting for the buyer to respond to the counter offer. It might have gone a couple of times. I think maybe there was seller counter offer and then another buyer counter offer and another seller counter offer, but whatever it is, the seller sent a counter offer off to the buyer. And as the counter offer forms do, they had an expiration date, just a default, which was 3 days from 5 p.m. on the third day after it was received. And the our listing agent had not received information, any response back from the buyer or the buyer's agent. They called the buyer's agent, and the buyer's agent said, yeah, they're thinking about it, the counteroffer. Now, in the meantime, the listing agent gets a call. Agents has a client, another agent has a client coming in from out of town. They need to buy a property while they're in town for 3 days, beginning on Saturday. They've looked at everything in the MLS online, and this is the property they think they want. They haven't seen the property, but they're going to be here Saturday and look at it. So it sounds promising. And the deal that was pending, that the counter offer is out on, was a little complex because it was one of those pyramid transactions. This buyer needed to sell a house to buy this house, so they had a COP, and they were in escrow to sell their house, and that buyer had had to sell their house. So there was 3 legs that had to happen for this transaction to happen. So it wasn't ideal. So our agent's talking to their client, the seller, and the seller says, I don't really like this deal. This other, new buyer sounds more interesting. Can we kind of withdraw our counteroffer? And so that was the question. And of course, the answer is yes. At any time prior to acceptance, a party can withdraw their offer or their counteroffer or whatever they put out there. And our agent was asking, well, what form do I use to do that? And I said, well, you don't really need a form. You just send an email to the other agent, say the seller hereby withdraws the counteroffer dated such and such. And that's sufficient notice to withdraw the counteroffer. Now, in this case, the time to respond to the counteroffer had already expired. So we didn't really need to send that even, because even if the counteroffer came back signed by the seller, the buyer, it's not valid because that offer had expired. So I said, why don't you call that agent, tell them, that offer's expired. And if they're going to resurrect their negotiations, they need to do so in the form of a new offer. So, and they could write an addendum to the old offer, reinstating the old offer, to make it simpler. But they would have to start from scratch, and it would be subject to the seller's approval. So that's kind of where it is. I'll note too that our agent used one of my no terms that we encourage none of our agents to use. And when he first called me about it, he said, well, the time to accept the counteroffer has expired, so they're out of contract. Well, they were never in contract. So, that's, a time period has expired. That's all that's happened. We don't know, out of contract is a legal term. And I discourage any of us from using legal terms in talking about contractual stuff. So we had a time period expire. Whether it's out of contract or not is not our decision. And so that was that one. Any questions on that? Okay. So I'm going to go back to the RPA for a minute. And we've had 2 transactions come up with a COP, and then one property transaction come up with a seller requirement to find replacement property, the SPRP. So these are complicated forms, so I wanted to just go over them one more time. I know we've gone over them in the past. So if your buyer's coming in and they do have a home they have to sell, they're going to check that box. And it's kind of an innocuous in the whole form. So, but it does say the CAR COP is attached, so you'll see it in the attachments and nothing else. Because when you're writing this up for the buyer, when you check that box, it'll automatically upload the COP to your package. So, so let's go look at the COP. So we haven't looked at that in a while. The COP. Okay. Should be able to see the contingency for sale of buyer's property form. If you can't, just unmute and let me know. But so this is a form with all the recitals. And then you get into a lot of selections in here. The buyer's property contingency. The agreement is contingent upon a buyer entering into contract for sale or escrow of the buyer property. And then you skip to 2 or 4, unless you check B or C. And B would be only entering into contract with the sale of the buyer's property. You jump to paragraph 2. Or only the close of escrow on the buyer's property if it's already in escrow, and then you would cite the escrow company and the escrow number. And you provide you'd attach verification of that to the COP form or deliver it 2 days after acceptance. So if you're going with 1A or 1B, you're going to skip to 2. And then it's the buyer, it's contingent upon the buyer entering into contract for the sale of the buyer's property, if 1A or 1B applies. And the buyer shall have 17 or some other number of days that you might put in there in which to enter into a contract for the sale of the buyer's property. And then B, to be by the earlier of the time specified in 2A, which is 17 days, or within 2 days of the buyer entering into the contract for the sale of the buyer's property, buyer shall deliver written evidence of the escrow holder. And then 3 deals with the listing status of buyer's property. If they've signed a listing agreement and it's in MLS, or it's going to be in MLS, that deals with evidence that the buyer is actually going about to sell the property. And talks about close of escrow. If either 1A or 1C applies, buyer has until the following time to close escrow on the sale of buyer's property. The scheduled close of the seller's property, that's the one in your original offer. So they had 60 days in their original offer, they have 60 days to close. They have to close within that time frame. And or if checked no later than 5 days prior to the scheduled close of escrow of the seller's property. Once buyer's property closes, buyer can no longer use this as a contingency to cancel the agreement. So the default is that it's coincident that the properties are going to close at the same time. And then the status of sale of the buyer's property. Buyer agrees to keep the seller informed, blah, blah, blah. And within 2 days after seller's written request, but no earlier than the applicable time, remove contingencies for the contract. The buyer shall deliver the seller evidence of the removed contingencies. So in this case, that's assuming that the seller can give them notice if they get a backup offer. That's covered in the backup offer part. Cancellation of buyer property. If property is in escrow and either party that escrow gives the other notice of cancellation, buyer thereafter shall deliver that notice to the seller. And then it talks about the right to get backup offers. And then again, you get a lot of options here. The primary one, important for the seller, is if the buyer is going to well, that's covered in number 8. But this is if the seller gets a backup offer they want to accept, they can give immediate right of notify buyer after any time of that acceptance. That would be the default. There's a delay. Number 2 here, C2 is delayed right no sooner than 17 days, which conforms to the 17 days. So that would give the buyer the clear 17 days to go find their property, get their property sold. And then there's this number 3, which is least desirable for the seller, and that is no right to notify the buyer. So they don't have a right to accept a backup offer, and they've got to wait out the whole process, both the sale and the closing. Now, removal of contingencies, seller's right to cancel, buyer right to cancel. This paragraph 11 is important. Time for performance of contract obligations and delivery of buyer deposit. So the default here says that that the contingency periods and the deposit, A and B, will both start in accordance with the RPA, what was ever in the RPA. So if they have 17 days to inspect the property, that starts right away. If the buyer were to have checked this box here on the day after the buyer delivers the seller the following escrow evidence for the buyer's property, then they don't have to start doing their inspections until they've sold the property, which might be good for the buyer because they don't have to spend money on reports and stuff like that. But it leaves the seller in limbo as to whether the buyer's going to remove the contingencies. Same with the deposit. The default is that it should be deposited into escrow in accordance with the RPA, which is 2 days or 3 days after acceptance. And the box checked would say after the escrow evidence, so that you would wait 17 days for your contingency, your deposit. So you can see there's a lot going on in that form. You want to be sure the seller understands it and your buyer understands it as you're filling it out, all those options. If you have any questions along the way, ask your manager, ask me. And because you want to get that form done correctly. Any questions on that? Curtis has a question in the chat. It's known as one of the worst CAR forms. Well, it's worse in the sense that it's hard to write a form like that covering all those alternatives, but they've done the best they can, and I'm sure they've looked at it over the years and tweaked it now and then. And the same is true of this other famous form. We'll go back to this. The SPRP. Is that what it is? Huh, I must not have that in there. Hold on a second. Gotta add it. SPRP. Seller purchase or replacement property. Okay. Okay, now let's open it up. SPRP. And this is the same kind of form, only in reverse. That the seller, you typically would say in your listing agreement, let's say we're representing the seller, you would put in your private remarks that it's subject to seller finding replacement properties. Sale will be subject to this seller finding replacement property. And then that can be discussed before a buyer writes an offer. So the buyer can expect to get this SPRP back as a counteroffer or a part of a counteroffer. And this just is reversed. Instead of the buyer having the right to sell their property, this is the seller has a right to find a property, or they've already entered into contract to buy a property. And is the close of the replacement property subject, to this contingency of this agreement or not? And then the time periods, similar to time periods, time periods in the agreement for inspections, contingencies, and so forth. This says they don't have to start until the seller finds the replacement property, or if you check that box, it says remain as specified in the agreement. So if the seller wants the buyer to go ahead with inspections, even though they haven't gone and found their replacement property, they can request that. Same with the deposit. The default is the deposit doesn't have to be put in until the seller finds a replacement property. But the seller may want to know they have a real deal, so they check that box. So they're kind of checking in reverse of the other one. Now, it talks about the buyer's right to cancel, seller's right to cancel. And all that. So if you're going to use this form, again, read it carefully and understand it. But what we had come up this week was the buyer gave an offer that was contingent on the sale of their property. The seller gave an offer on the counteroffer saying that it's subject to them finding a replacement property. So we had both at work here. And the seller didn't want to start looking for their property until the buyer sold their property. So we had to put in here that the paragraph 1A shall not commence until buyer satisfies conditions of selling their property pursuant to the COP attached, blah, blah, blah. So it was an additional layer of complication that kind of we had to create because that's not built into the form. So I don't know, they're going to review that, all of that with the seller today, see if the seller sends that all back to the buyer, and then what the buyer does with it, we'll see. Okay, any questions on that little exercise? Okay, well, those are the topics I had for today.
Hey, Gary, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure, Keely.
So I have a transaction up in Humboldt and the close of escrow, well, the seller is going to be on a cruise. So she's not going to be able to sign her closing papers in time. However, the buyer doesn't, she's going to have to move into the property before we're going to have to do an extension for close of escrow. And then the buyer wants to move into the property early. What form do we use for that?
Well, ideally, we discourage that practice.
I know what I told her that.
Some of the worst cases we've had experiences when a buyer moves into a property prior to closing. I used to work for a home builder in Chicago, and we built 1,200 homes a year. And once we let someone move into the property before closing, and they just kind of wouldn't close because they found all these things they didn't like about the property all of a sudden, because now they're living in it. We've had a buyer move into a property, discovered there was more noise in it at the property than they expected, more street noise, and they decided to cancel the closing altogether. And so they moved back out and canceled the deal. So bad things can happen when a buyer moves into a property before closing. That's our first proviso. Now there is a form, I think it's called buyer occupancy prior to close of escrow.
Okay.
Let me see if I can find it here real quick. Let's go back and see if I have it here. Buyer. No. Let's see if it's under forms. Buyer occupancy. Buyer early occupancy addendum. There's three here. There's the buyer early occupancy addendum, the buyer pre-occupancy storage addendum, and the interim occupancy agreement. See what that one says. Possession prior to close of escrow, buyer in possession prior. So you'd want to look over those the 3 forms and see which is applicable to your thing. But so yeah, and that points out if you, before going all the way to buyer moving into the property, you would want to try to explore whether, well, can you just store your stuff in the property
Okay,
and not physically move it?
okay,
And actually give them compensation, to stay somewhere else until they can close. So that would be a alternative that you want to explore before giving the using the interim occupancy agreement.
okay.
The
Yeah.
buyer occupancy agreement. So it's just bad things happen when a buyer moves into the property.
Thank you,
Sorry
Barry.
about that. Yeah, okay. Curtis says, how many offers are now contingent on the sale of another property? Boy, I think we've seen an uptick in that. But I can't give you I can't quantify it. Yeah, and Curtis advises, make sure you have insurance when you've got that, and those forms provide for that. They call for everybody to get their proper insurance in order to use either the storage in the house or the occupancy of the house. And the forms address insurance, which is good. Okay, any other questions? Okay, then I'll try to include that that little link on the wildfire disclosure in the along with the recording and the link for Monday's webinar if you haven't signed up for that already. All right, you guys all have a good weekend. Thanks for checking in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See y'all later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.